Coburn.
It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, Labour MP Wes Streeting, former Brexit Party MEP Richard Tice, Conservative MP Caroline Nokes, and presenter, economist and author of How to Make the World Add Up, Tim Harford. Today, deal or no deal?
There really was no progress made yesterday. We've got to try to make a breakthrough at some point today.
We will keep negotiating for as long as we have available time or until we get an agreement.
The first COVID vaccines arrive, but are the right people being prioritised for the jab? Millwall fans boo as players take the knee. It's an anti-racist gesture, but is it also a political statement? Let's start with negotiations that are continuing in Brussels in a last-ditch attempt to agree a post-Brexit trade deal between the UK and the EU. Just to start off briefly, will there be a deal or not, Wes?
Well, let's hope so, because the alternative is, I think, something we don't really want to contemplate.
Richard?
I think there will be a deal. I'm quite willing, and I've always been very willing to contemplate no deal. I was the person who coined no deal is always better than a bad deal. And the government is playing quite the right bat. They're making it quite clear they're prepared to walk away if it's not an acceptable deal.
Caroline, what's your view? Will there be a deal or not?
I very much hope so. And talking to constituents on a daily basis, those who run businesses in this part of the country, they are absolutely terrified at the prospect of tariffs on things like medical foods, baby foods, and the prospect of medicines not getting through.
Tim, how do you see it?
Well, the Irish Prime Minister says it's 50-50, and I don't think I'm going to be able to outguess him. So I don't know. I hope so. We've got ourselves into an extraordinary situation, but we're just going to have to see.
Right. Well, lots of people always expect it to be the sort of 11th hour when it comes to negotiations like this. Let's test the temperature with our correspondents in London and in Brussels. First of all, with Helen in London. What is the latest? Are we expecting any progress today?
Well, the mood here is certainly a lot less optimistic than it was this time last week. And in terms of sort of hopes of a breakthrough, actually, it feels like it's sort of gone backwards more than anywhere else. Last night, EU sources suggesting there had been progress on fishing, one of the sticking points. UK sources moved very quickly to shut that down. This morning, absolutely scotched it, said that EU sources had literally made it up. And then the EU side has come out and said, no, there was no progress either. So it's certainly feeling a lot more gloomy this morning. But of course, the talks are ongoing. They are still talking, and that means that the possibility of a deal isn't entirely closed off. I think we'll get a better sense of it after that phone call that is scheduled later between Boris Johnson and Ursula von der Leyen at 4 o'clock this afternoon. All
right. Well, just before I go back to you and on to Kevin in Brussels, let's hear a little bit more from the Irish Foreign Minister, Simon Coveney. He'd spoken to Michel Barnier.
Having heard from Michel Barnier this morning, really the news is very downbeat. I would say he was very gloomy and obviously very cautious about the ability to make progress today. There was news last night on some media sources that there was a breakthrough on fishing. That is absolutely not the case from what we're hearing this morning. So I'm not quite sure where that came from. There really was no progress made yesterday. That's our understanding. And so we've got to try to make a breakthrough at some point today.
Helen, he also talking there about the disputed fishing agreement on both sides. But take us through this other issue of a level playing field, because in many, many ways, we don't seem to have moved at all, if that is still at the core of the discussions between the two sides.
Yes, and of course when we talk about the level playing field, what we're talking about there is a set of shared rules or common standards that both sides will agree to observe. It's pretty standard in trade deals, but the sticking point here is how much and how strictly they should be applied to the UK. Now, the EU's big concern is that it doesn't want the UK businesses to have access to its markets, but perhaps with extra support from the UK government or with some less onerous rules or something that would give UK firms an advantage over EU ones. For the UK, the big concern is that it absolutely does not want to be tied to EU rules in perpetuity. So it's trying to find a mechanism for how that would work and also how you would enforce them. And of course, I think part of the reason it's such a sticking point is that it really goes to the heart of what both sides want out of this negotiation. For the EU, it's all about protecting the single market. For the UK, the heart of Brexit, the point of Brexit was to be able to set our own rules and move on. So I think that's why it's proving such a sticking point.
Well, and on the basis of what Helen has just said, Kevin, do the members, the 27 member countries, share that sort of gloomy outlook we heard there from Simon Coveney and also from the chief negotiator for the EU, Michel Barnier?
Well, of course, they take their cue from Michel Barnier. I suppose this is the kind of moment when we have to remember that the number of people who really know what's going on these three sticking point issues is extremely small. Michel Barnier, of course, is one of them. If he is as downbeat and gloomy as we're hearing that he was in the briefings he gave this morning, then of course that's a bad sign. He is very conscious that time is running out. His famous clock is always running, of course. He described himself rather curiously as neither optimistic nor pessimistic, but realistic. And on first hearing, I thought that was a very wise-sounding summary of events. On second hearing, it sounds a little bit meaningless. He's really not giving very much away. And I think the point is that we shouldn't see these three remaining issues as separate issues. They're like a three-dimensional interlocking puzzle. You can't fix one of them without fixing the other two at the same time. And I suspect that's where the confusion on fisheries came from. But of course, it's also why things are so complex, all being played out against a backdrop of a very limited amount of time. Right,
and you mentioned the confusion over the fishing briefing. The UK sources here were certainly saying that actually the progress that had been made was an agreement between EU countries because there had been a fracturing on the issue of fishing rights. Is that how you see it?
I think that's very likely to be true. The European Union has some coastal states for whom fisheries are very important, like Belgium and France, and other countries like Bulgaria and Germany, for where they're much less important. So for the European Union to agree its own landing point on fisheries, what it's prepared to give up, what it's prepared to accept, that would be an important step. But it's also perfectly possible that that confusion comes because of the way the issues interlock with each other. It may be that one side is saying, look, here is a bottom line that we can accept on fisheries if we get something on the level playing field that comes back in our direction. So it may not be that it was entirely wrong, that there was some sort of talk of agreement, but that we have to view it, as I say, part of that interlocking puzzle. All right. And I suppose it kind of sums up the state of relations, doesn't it, when you're denying that progress has been made. That must tell you something.
It does, and we'll discuss that now with our panellists. Thank you to both of you. Let me start with you, Wes. What is the point of Brexit if the UK is still signed up to the rules and governance of the EU?
Well, we don't know what the deal looks like yet. The key thing the government's got to bear in mind, particularly if it's staring at the prospect of leaving without any deal whatsoever, is what that means for people's jobs and livelihoods, for the economy, particularly when we're in the middle of a pandemic, which is having extraordinary economic consequences. But particularly for our country, we're facing, I think, the worst of the lot in terms of advanced economies and our experience of the recession. So the last thing we need on top of everything else we're dealing with at the moment is the prospect of a no-deal scenario, which puts more jobs and businesses at risk.
Right, so you would accept any deal at any price to avoid no deal?
The key thing is the government comes back with a deal. Boris Johnson said he had an oven-ready deal. We haven't seen it.
This oven-ready deal, just to explain to viewers, when Boris Johnson was talking about that, he was talking about the withdrawal agreement, about the divorce settlement, not the trading relationship that is being negotiated now with the EU.
I'm not sure that most people in this country would draw a distinction. And frankly, when the government is running around saying, isn't it great we've got a trade deal with Japan, we've got these great trade talks going on with other countries, what is is the point of talking about the importance of trade deals when our nearest and biggest trading partner, with whom we already have an intricate series of agreements, is the one where we haven't yet struck a deal. So, time is of the essence, the clock's ticking, and jobs and livelihoods are at stake. And that's why I find it pretty extraordinary, actually, that here we are at the beginning of December, 3.5 years after the referendum, without any signs of a deal with the European Union. It's crazy.
Caroline?
Well, of course, Wes could have voted for a deal several times last year, as I did, because I was very keen to see us establish a relationship with the EU that would enable us to trade with them under, a new set of rules. But I think that we'd negotiated a pretty good deal last year. Now, the reality is the clock is ticking. We are fast running out of time. But it is about jobs. It's about people's economic security. We know that no deal, it could potentially cost us 2% of GDP straight away. That's a huge hit to take on top of COVID, which is why I think it's crucially important that the next 48 hours or so sort this out. We always knew it was going to go down to the wire. I'm going to sound a little bit like my colleague David Davis when I say this is how EU negotiations always happen. It always goes to the 11th hour, but the time is now. We really have to get this sorted this week.
Right. Richard, you'd call any deal a betrayal, wouldn't you?
No, not at all. I mean, it's right to try for a deal, but as I said earlier, it's got to be a deal on the right terms. And, if you're prepared to sign up to any deal, as Wes appears to be, then you're going to end up with a really bad deal. You always have to, in a negotiation, and we business people know this, you have to be prepared to walk away. And the government has held firm on this, and that is good. And I think that has surprised the European Union. So let's see. As I said earlier, I think there will be a deal because ultimately, when the EU realise actually that we're serious about walking away, they will shift, and it'll probably be some form of partial deal where both sides can claim they've maintained some red lines. And when we get through into the new year, there'll still be additional stuff that we're talking about for months and indeed probably years afterwards. But let's be clear, there are far more jobs and livelihoods on the line because of the government's flawed coronavirus strategy than we're talking about in terms of a no deal or deal with regard.
Well, we're going to talk about COVID in just a moment, but Tim, you are a man in charge of the numbers, let's put it this way, for this programme here. When we talk about no deal, what are the numbers that people should be looking at?
Well, most economic forecasters think that it will be just a slow erosion of the UK's economic position over the next 10 or 15 years. I guess we may find out the hard way. What puzzles me, your very first question to Wes was, what is the point of Brexit if, and I would have just stopped at what is the point of Brexit? I think the problem is when the referendum was put before the British people, the person who put it before us said Brexit was a bad idea. Then we had Theresa May, that was David Cameron. Then we had Theresa May, who said Brexit means Brexit. We had Boris Johnson, who said, well, don't worry about what Brexit means, we're going to get it done. And I don't think the country has really ever had a conversation, a really serious conversation, about what it is that we are hoping to be able to do when we take back control. And until we've had that conversation, it's no surprise that the negotiations just seem to be lost in a fog.
Right. Well, Caroline, what is the UK government hoping we'll be able to do?
Well, I think it gives us control over our own laws, over our own borders. We've all heard those two things repeatedly. I think importantly, we have to uphold the vote that was expressed back in 2016. And it's absolutely critical that the transition period comes to an end at the end of this year and we can move forward. Now, I think that Richard is actually right. This is only the beginning. There will be years and years of negotiations because there are so many areas in which our relationship with Europe is going to be complicated by having left the single market. Of course it is. But I think the vision that the government has is one where, as a sovereign nation, we are able to set our own laws, that we're not bound by European courts, that we can have a decent trading agreement with the EU, level playing fields and rights over our own fishing.
Wes?
I mean, years and years of negotiation, a kind of a downturn in our economic prospects. I mean, I don't remember seeing that written on the side of a bus. And at the point, one thing I do agree with Caroline about is that after a referendum and 2 general elections, and by the way, having left the European Union, that debate is over. The only question now is whether or not we're going to have a trade agreement with our nearest and biggest trading partner. The answer to that question should obviously be yes. The only question we're facing today is, where is it? Why has it taken so long? Why have both sides not come up with a deal that, let's be honest, will protect the interests of people on both sides of the channel?
Richard?
Well, we need freedom. It's all about freedom. And actually, we've seen the benefit of that freedom just with the ability for the MHRA to approve the new vaccine.
Oh, well, hang on a second. No, because we need to clear this point up, because we talked about this last week where there were claims made by ministers that it was because we've left the EU that somehow we were not and no longer under regulations by the EU that we were the first to approve that vaccine.
And
that is not correct. That is not the reason we were first. There may be another reason, but it wasn't because we were no longer under the auspices of the EU, because we still are until we leave that at the end of the transition period on December the 31st.
We have more freedom to make that decision. We went through the MHRA.
Sorry, what does that mean, Richard?
The government chose to use the MHRA, right, to make that judgment, to give that approval, as opposed to what the other 27 nations have done, which is to wait for the European Union's own regulatory body. We've had that ability, we've made that choice, the government's bought vaccines, and we're therefore the first to be able to actually start to use those vaccines from this week onwards. And that is because this government has taken control of key decision makings, and that's a good thing. It's a small example, but a really important example. That's the whole point about taking back control.
And Tim, isn't that the thing, the crux of the matter in terms of Brexit for many people? It isn't about the numbers. It isn't, to some extent, about the economy. It is about identity. It is about freedom.
Well, it seems all rather vague or untrue. I mean, the Medical Health Regulatory Agency has had the power to approve vaccines in a public health emergency since, I believe, 2012. So that's not about Brexit. We heard from Caroline, we're taking back control. The same thing. I understand this is what the British public voted for, but I think we're still very unclear about really what we're actually planning to do with this freedom. The control over our own rules. What is it that we're planning to do? I still haven't heard anybody explain it to me.
Right, well, Caroline, can you explain it?
Well, I think there's a whole range of issues, and I'd start with farming, and we saw the agriculture bill that ministers have been working so hard over the last few months to get over the line and get done, and that's about making sure that we can set the priorities for our own farmers about how they're going to implement environmental improvements, how we can look at things like stopping live export of animals to the continent. I think that's a great thing. But in every sphere, we will be looking to make sure that it is the UK that sets the standards, that sets the rules by which we're governed, and that we're no longer answerable to the EU. Now, I didn't vote for that. I didn't campaign for that. I think that we're better off part of the single market. But if I want to see anything this week, then it has to be about getting a deal over the line.
Tim, do you accept that when it comes to farming, those changes that could be made by the government, or could they have been done, in your view, under the EU?
I'm not familiar with the details of the farming changes. So, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people in the UK, we don't follow the details. We don't follow the details of what's going on with the border in the Irish Sea. We don't follow the details of the regulatory agencies. We just trust our politicians to make sensible decisions on our behalf.
Yes.
And I do worry that it all seems to be a little bit vague.
Right. Well, let's talk about something specific, Richard, because actually we heard from the Environment Secretary yesterday, George Eustace, who did say that actually food prices will rise, modestly, he said, but they will rise if there isn't a trade deal with the EU. People will understand that and they'll notice it.
Well, I mean, the reality is that the supermarkets that sell the vast majority of our food are incredibly competitive. We had all this before when there was a currency shift after the referendum, and actually it was barely noticeable. Inflation was incredibly low. So, and, you know, if certain food products do rise in value, then guess what consumers will do? They might look elsewhere. They might look at different products. That's how competition works, and that's a good thing. I think the supermarkets will keep the prices incredibly tight. It's a very, very competitive market. I think we've seen it before, and I think that'll continue. And that's a good thing. We love competition. It's good to drive down prices for consumers.
Well, I'm glad Richard's acknowledged the reality, but this is it now. Brexit is the reality. They won the referendum. You won the referendum. Boris Johnson and the Conservatives have won 2 general elections. There are no excuses, no hiding places. Boris Johnson has got the responsibility and the mandate. So if we are seeing food prices rise or the lack of a deal, poorer security cooperation, jobs in manufacturing hit, that is all on Boris Johnson. It will be Boris Johnson's deal or it will be Boris Johnson's no deal. The choice is now up to him, but the responsibility lies solely at his feet.
Right, so does that mean Labour will not support a deal because, as you say, you don't want to be part of this?
Well, we don't know if we have a deal, first question. Secondly, we don't know what votes will be brought forward, whether the government will have a vote on a deal or whether it be implementation legislation. We will do our job, which is to scrutinise effectively and to make decisions based on what's brought forward. But at the moment, what we're saying very clearly to the government is that it is our national interest for you to deliver a trade agreement with the European Union. So where is it?
Right, but on the biggest decision probably facing the country in a generation, are you saying that the Labour Party may not either oppose the deal or vote for it, that you might actually abstain?
Well, we just haven't seen the deal. I don't think it's a reasonable question.
Well, you could rule out abstention. You could either vote for something or vote against it.
I think in the past we've seen principled arguments made for abstention. It's never a comfortable position, by the way. I do think most people across the country don't understand why on big decisions you would abstain. But there is always, and there always has been, a parliamentary principle of abstention, which is where you don't want to block the government from making a decision, but you're not comfortable to actually support the decision that's been brought forward. So that's what we do in abstention in abstract terms. But I would prefer the government to have a good deal that protects our national interest and one that we can get behind. At the moment, we don't have any deal in front of us whatsoever.
Caroline, in terms of comfortable, being comfortable when it comes to voting, you voted in favour of the Internal Market Bill. That is coming back into the House of Commons today before MPs. It does contain clauses that, if they were ever enacted, would break international law in the withdrawal agreement. Will you do that again?
I didn't vote for those clauses last time, and I won't be voting for them tonight.
You didn't? So you didn't vote?
No, I voted. So I voted for the Internal Markets Bill at second reading because it was absolutely imperative that we had a functioning internal market post the end of the transition period. So it's an important bill. It's something that we have to have. However, those clauses that broke international law, I did not vote for them when they came before the House a couple of months ago, and I will not be voting for them tonight.
Right, OK, we're going to leave it there and move on to the COVID vaccine. We may be able to show you some of the pictures of the vaccines actually arriving. And if we don't, they are arriving and they're going to be administered to the first set of people from tomorrow. Let's have a look at the priority list. We showed it to you actually last week. Here it is. Number 1, residents in a care home for older adults and their carers. Number 2, all those 80 years of age and over, frontline health and social care workers. And so it goes on right down to number 9, all those 50 years of age and over. Tim, is that the right priority list in your mind?
I think it's possible to overthink these things. It's very clear that risk of death from contracting COVID is very closely connected with your age. There are other things, ethnicity, gender, health conditions, but it is very much to do with age. 38% of people who died so far in the UK were resident in nursing homes, most of them very elderly, and another 30% or so were over the age of 80. So if all the people in care homes plus all the people over the age of 80, that is more than 2/3 of all the people who have died so far. So yeah, you can draw some fine distinctions. You could say, maybe my father's 77 and suffers from diabetes. Maybe he should be vaccinated with the 80-year-olds. His risk is probably higher than some 80-year-olds. But, in the end, we're not going to be vaccinating people in the perfect order. We've just got to get the vaccines out there and to the vulnerable as quickly as possible. And
Caroline, do your constituents agree broadly?
Well, I'm beginning to get some post-bag with people trying to make a case that they should be in a higher priority group than they are. But I think it's absolutely right that care home residents go first. That's where we've seen a terrible, terrible death toll. And of course, we also have people in care homes who can't have their families come visit them, who are desperately lonely. So I think that's absolutely the right priority. Of course, we want frontline healthcare workers to also be protected. I'm actually going to agree with Richard. I have no doubt that we will not roll this out in a perfect fashion. However, the important thing here is speed, getting it to people. We have done brilliantly well, not only to negotiate the quantity of the Pfizer vaccine that we have, but also the Oxford vaccine, which is such a triumph for British science. So I just want to see as many people vaccinated as possible, as quickly as possible.
What do you think about the priority list, Wes? Would you broadly agree with it?
Yes, these decisions have to be clinically led. And of course, we would want to add people to the list. And, as Shadow Schools Minister, I'm really worried about making sure we keep our schools fully staffed. So teaching and support staff would be on my priority list. The important thing is that the list itself is clinically led And ultimately, the responsibility is there on the government to get enough vaccine and out quickly, and hopefully, having learned from some of the mistakes made on track and trace, the logistical side of this enormous operation will run more smoothly.
Richard?
Wes is right. The key is the logistical administration of the vaccine, so that is done efficiently, promptly, clinically led. But let's not forget the other side of this. In the excitement of the vaccine, let's not forget the flawed strategy with regard to tiers, with lockdowns, which is all based, the whole government strategy is based around its confidence in the PCR tests. And it is quite clear, evidence is emerging as more and more people are using the lateral flow test. We're seeing it in Liverpool, where just lateral flow tests represented just 1 in 5 of the PCR tests in the same community. Merthyr Tydfil, a hotspot in Wales. Again, as soon as you start losing the lateral flow tests, the number of cases plummeting. Universities of Bristol and St Andrews, numbers plummeting. So what I challenge the government, if they've still got confidence in these PCR tests, then let's test it. Let's treble check it with the lateral flow test. Let's take 1,000 people and let's test it with the PCR test, with the lateral flow test, and with a separate, independently processed PCR test. Because if there is significant false positives, that we believe there are, significant contamination in the government's laboratories, then the whole strategy is based on flawed data, and that would be really, really serious.
Tim, what is the evidence in terms of the accuracy of PCR tests?
Well, PCR tests are substantially more sensitive than lateral flow tests, so I'm not at all surprised that when you test someone with a lateral flow test, you're less likely to come up with a positive test than with a PCR test. I mean, there are, of course, false positives, but I'm surprised to say that the whole strategy is linked to confidence in the PCR test. The government strategy is designed to stop hospitals being overwhelmed and to reduce the number of deaths. We had more deaths per capita in the UK than almost any other country in the world. It's taken an enormous toll to the British public health. The hospitals, are huge numbers of people going into hospitals. So it's not to do with the tests or the sensitivity of the tests. It is to do with people dying.
Right.
And a lot of people have died in this country.
If you look at the excess deaths,
yes.
this year 2020 will turn out to be just above the 30-year average.
Well, hang on.
It'll only be about 10% above.
Hang on. When you look at the excess, when you look at the excess deaths, hang on a
growth.
second, Richard. This is from Public Health England, and it says just over 61,000 excess deaths in England, 97.5% of which were due to COVID.
But the reality is, if you look across the whole year, this year will be about 10% higher than the 5-year average. It will be in terms of total deaths, OK? So what's happening is that I believe, people are being allocated as a COVID-related death, potentially because of the huge number of potentially contaminated false positives coming out of the PCR tests. Why is it, for example, that currently, week on week, respiratory attendances in hospitals are way down, and yet they're being allocated as COVID people? But actually, you expect hospitals and ICU departments to be busy at this time of the year. They're no busier than normal.
Right, but hang on. Well, let Tim respond.
So I don't understand this. There were 67,000 excess deaths during the small number of weeks of the first wave. The life expectancy in the UK has been rising for decades. So I don't see why we would want to compare excess deaths now to the 30-year average going all the way back to 1990. Well,
it's only 10% above the 5-year average.
Not a great way of... And it's 10% above the 5-year average, which is an enormous number of people who have died. And it is partly because of the huge efforts we've all taken. We've all been staying at home. We've all been trying to look after each other, stop the virus spreading. If we had let it spread, many more people would have died.
There are over 30...
if you look, another way of looking at the data is to look at what the Office for National Statistics registrations of deaths has been, with COVID identified as the source of death on the death certificate. And you get a very similar number, maybe 45, 50,000. I've lost track of the latest.
There are over 30,000 excess deaths of non-COVID patients at home since this crisis began. So the excess deaths that
where are you getting your data from? Because if we're agreeing, if we're agreeing that the data is what is important, you can't dismiss what Public Health England have said in terms of the number of excess deaths, the vast majority are due to COVID.
Well, it's also in the ONS data, the excess deaths at home compared to the 5-year average. So it's different parts of ONS data, but it's there for people to see. There's no doubt about it. And, I believe that the real crisis is the government's total reliance and trust in this PCR data. And if I'm right, that there are a significant number of false positives, then this government strategy is flawed. And I come back to the point, hospitals and ICU departments are no busier across the country than they normally are at this time of the year. And maybe that's telling us something.
Right. Well, Tim, what do you say in response to the whole fact that it was all about the NHS not being overwhelmed? And we have seen every week, if not nightly, hospitals saying that they are at risk of being overwhelmed unless action is taken.
Yes, I mean, a lot of the strategy was about preventing the NHS being overwhelmed, and I think it was broadly successful. I mean, we have to recognise that people have made enormous sacrifices in order to look after both the NHS and to look after each other. So the fact that strategy has partly been successful, we've, as I said, a huge death toll has partly been successful, doesn't then mean we should say, well, we should throw the strategy out.
Caroline and Wes, let me just get your response, particularly on the justification, Caroline, of the lockdown was in part about not overwhelming the NHS. What do you say in response to Richard and, in fact, many of your colleagues in the Conservative Party who are against the tiered system of restrictions?
Well, it absolutely was about making sure that the NHS wasn't overwhelmed, and it was successful in that. But it's more than that, because actually NHS staff, our brilliant frontline workers, have been working incredibly hard over months and months and months. They are exhausted. So to take unnecessary risks with the NHS now strikes me as being extremely foolhardy. So that's why I supported the measures last week. I've seen my area go into Tier 2, where there are still restrictions on the way people can go about their lives. But I've kept my parents locked up since March. Literally locked up. I've done all of their shopping for them. I have run every errand, and at one point parked my car over their driveway so that they couldn't get out, because I'm absolutely determined that they are not going to increase the burden on our brilliant health service. So, I'm enjoying very much listening to Richard and Tim arguing about the numbers. Obviously, it's clear which one's the expert.
Richard.
Well, it comes back to the point I originally made. The whole strategy, everything that Caroline's just spoken about, is trust in the PCR testing. And if in these lighthouse laboratories there is significant contamination and therefore many of these cases are false positives, then actually the whole strategy falls apart.
Caroline?
Can I come back on that? Because in Southampton, we have had the most brilliant saliva testing pilot going on for months now, where they have had 0 false positives, and we have seen an incredibly low rate in our university students here. And there was real fear when the students came back that they would somehow bring COVID with them and spread it around the city, and we have not seen that. We've seen phenomenally low rates because they've been identified quickly. They've been successful.
And she's just proven my point, because there are very low numbers when you use different types of tests.
All right.
The PCR test is throwing up 5% every day, every week, give or take. Right? You look at Liverpool, the lateral flow tests are throwing up 20% of what the PCR test is throwing up.
All right, let me just go to Wes before we move on. Now we've got the vaccine coming online, about 4 million doses before Christmas, and there will be more in the new year. For you, is this now about reaching a herd immunity or about protecting the vulnerable so that we can start to open up the country more and more before vaccinating the entire population?
Yeah, well, two things. It is about protecting the vulnerable, and it is about reducing the risk to the NHS. We want things to return to normal as soon as possible. So that means not just protecting the vulnerable, but the other key message we've got to get out to the general population is the importance of this vaccine, and that we can have confidence in this vaccine. And we shouldn't be complacent about the anti-vaxxer movement out there and the extent to which online misinformation and propaganda is scaring people into potentially not having the vaccine. And I hope that people will have confidence in this. We should be proud of this achievement on behalf of the scientists, both in our country and internationally. And we have I will get my vaccine as soon as I'm able to. I'm not interested in jumping the queue, but I have every confidence in it.
You're a bit young. You're not on the priority list, probably,
thanks,
are
Jo.
you, in the first 9? Right, we're going to move on
for
and leave it there, because we're going to talk about this championship match between Millwall and Derby County at Millwall's ground at the weekend. Millwall players, we can show you some pictures here. Pre-match, they took the knee. In fact, a lot of the players did, and they were booed by some of the fans in the stand. Now, the footballers kneeling in response to Black Lives Matter was something that was put to the Environment Secretary, George Eustace. He was asked about it yesterday, and this is what he said.
The issue of race and racial discrimination is something that we all take very, very seriously. My personal view is that Black Lives Matter, capital B, L and M, is actually a political movement that is different to what most of us believe in, which is standing up for racial equality. But look, each individual can take their own choices about how they reflect this, and I know a number of people feel quite strongly and have taken that approach.
Right. Well, George Eustace's response prompted this headline in The Guardian. Minister fails to condemn Millwall fans who booed players taking a knee. The Kick It Out chair chides George Eustace for lazy conflation and providing cover for racists. Do you agree, Ash Sarkar, who joins us now from Novara Media, with the way the Kick It Out campaign group has characterised it?
Well, I think the response of Millwall as a club to the disgusting behaviour of their fans was completely laughable. They saw the same images as the rest of us, which were a section of Millwall fans booing their own black players taking a symbolic action against racism, and said actually it's because of lots of sophisticated reasons in which people feel uncomfortable with the precise political orientation of BLM and whatever. It's a complete joke. We know that racism isn't confined to one club. I don't think a single club has got an unblemished record on this issue, but there is a particular history with sections of Millwall's fans, going back to when there was racist chanting targeting Heung-min Son, chanting DVD and 3 for a fiver, right back to when the club was actually fined because of a large number of racist chants targeting a South Asian player. And I don't think that the FA has taken as strong a line as they could have on this pattern of behaviour from Millwall.
Right, but what about George Eustace's, the minister's response that actually this is about Black Lives Matter, it's a movement, it's a political organisation?
Well, the taking of a knee was actually before this renaissance of Black Lives Matter, which was, sort of spurred into existence because of the murder of George Floyd. It was from Colin Kaepernick, who was advised to take the knee as a symbolic action by a Green Beret. So it's something which has got a very different kind of history. Obviously, not everyone's going to agree with every single one of Black Lives Matter's tactics or means of protesting.
Right.
That's important in a democracy. There's healthy disagreement.
Right.
But if you've got more of a problem with the way in which they protest rather than the thing that they're protesting, I would say there's an issue.
Right. Well, Caroline, where do you see it? Do you agree with George Eustace that actually some people might not be comfortable with the whole idea of taking the knee because they see Black Lives Matter as a political organisation, or is it a symbolic anti-racist gesture?
Oh, I think it's an incredibly symbolic gesture, and absolutely I have no hesitation in condemning Millwall fans who were booing their own black players. I have a brilliant constituent, a chap called Paul Williams, who was a Southampton footballer way back in the 80s and 90s, and he has spoken to me on many an occasion about the racism he faced in his playing career, what an impact it had on him, and that's turned him into a real crusader against racism wherever he finds it, because he doesn't want his kids to go through the same thing.
Right, so George Eustace was wrong?
Well, I wouldn't have said what George said. I think, sure, the whole Black Lives Matter movement is bigger than that, but this particular instance where you had footballers showing respect and unity, as Ash says, it's a symbolic gesture which I absolutely respect those footballers and condemn those fans.
Right. Is Black Lives Matter a political organisation as far as you're concerned, Richard?
As I understand, they've actually applied to be a registered political party. I don't know where that's got to, but let's be very clear. As George Eustace said, Black Lives Matter, capital B, capital M, capital L, capital M, they are anti-police, they're anti-capitalism, they're anti-the family. They are a dangerous Marxist organisation that should be condemned by everybody. But equally, Ash is also correct. Millwall does have a very bad historic record on racism, which is appalling. We all detest it. And I guess the question is, were all of those people booing, were they doing it because they're racist, or were some of them regretting the politicisation of football, or were they actually against the organisation BLM? We probably don't know.
Wes?
Right, let's get a reality check. First of all, Black Lives Matter may be an organisation registering as a political party. It is also well understood as a movement, as a hashtag, as a basic statement that we believe in equality, and we recognise that in too many cases, whether through overt or indirect discrimination, the impression is being given that black lives don't matter. So let's correct that. Secondly, it is the job of government ministers not to pontificate on these sorts of things or to be commentators about other people's activity. but to show leadership. So where is the leadership about both the rise in hate crime in our country, but also the institutional discrimination and the indirect discrimination that we see so well evidenced in our criminal justice system, in our education system, in employment? We've had report after report with lots of worthy practical actions recommended to government, but precious little by way of action. So it would be nice for just one weekend not to have ministers having a pop at the National Trust, or maybe when you see racism on your screen to have the courage to at least condemn it. But most of all, they are in government. They have the ability to affect change that makes a difference to people's lives. So where's the action on racial injustice in our country?
Caroline?
Well, I think Wes makes a very good point. And as chair of the Women and Equality Select Committee, we've been doing an enormous amount of work alongside the Petitions Committee on Black History Month, and where we want to see the issue placed in the national curriculum about the disproportionate impact COVID has had on people from BAME backgrounds. So I think it's crucially important, as Wes says, that we pick up those reports that have been numerous, and some of them for want of a better phrase, quite elderly now, so old reports, and make sure that we start implementing change. And certainly as a select committee chair, it is absolutely my duty to hold the government to account, to scrutinise what they're doing and pick them up where I don't think they're acting fast enough.
Tim, how did you view the minister's comments?
Well, I'm slightly surprised that we're asking him to comment on the actions of footballers and the actions of football fans, rather than asking him what he and his government are doing to combat racism. That's really what I want from politicians, particularly from government ministers, is not culture war. I want action. I think it's clear. The footballers who were kneeling to symbolise their opposition to racism. It's pretty clear what happens if you boo somebody who's kneeling to signal their opposition to racism. But I mean, I recognise that somebody journalist asked him the question, and he took the opportunity to fire off his opinion. But I'm not that interested in what government ministers think of footballers or think of football fans. I want to hear about what the policy actions they're taking are.
Richard?
I think we must never be complacent. We must always make progress. Wes makes some good points, but what I regret is the suggestion that the UK is institutionally racist across the board. We are not. We are an incredibly welcoming, tolerant nation, and we should celebrate that and be proud of that. But we can always do better. And there are various reports, some of which have sat on the shelf for too long. So let's keep doing better, but let's not do ourselves down and sort of infer that we're institutionally racist. We are not. We are making huge progress. We must continue to do so.
Ash?
Well, I mean, I couldn't help but laugh at Richard's earlier comments about BLM being a scary anti-capitalist, anti-family organisation. As Wes said, it's widely recognised as a movement of, hundreds of thousands of people who share a shared goal about combating institutional racism, particularly in law enforcement. Because what it reminds me of is the fact that Martin Luther King, when he was alive, never enjoyed the support of the majority of white Americans. He simply didn't. 2/3 of white Americans had a negative view of him. Why? Because he was characterised as a Marxist, as in league with the communists. And this wasn't some fringe idea. This is what the FBI was saying. So I don't think there's anything wrong with being a Marxist. It would be kind of hypocritical if I did. However, this is how anti-racist movements throughout history have been delegitimised. It's by this kind of red scare tactics, and it's absurd. And I think, and I'm really glad about this, more and more people can see through the absolute absurd guff that's coming from people like Richard Tice.
Richard?
Ash is entitled to a view. I've expressed my view. I think what she's just talked about is absurd guff. It's not going to help, actually, this debate to throw, obscenities at each other. I think what we should try and do in a constructive way is say we've made great progress, but there's always more to do. And where we're one of the most tolerant, welcoming nations in the world, let's continue that.
But why characterise the movement then as a Marxist movement when clearly there are lots of different groups under the banner of Black Lives Matter?
Because the main movement, the main organisation, you've only got to look at their website, and that clearly says they want to defund the police, they're anti-capitalist, and they're anti-family. It's not rocket science. That's what they stand for, and they've registered as a political party.
That's all. That's all we've got time for from all of us here. Bye bye.